This will be an overview of the steps in the lab in the blockchain programming exercise where you write a little bit of code and deploy that to a blockchain network in Bluemix. We're going to start off here in the Bluemix Classic view, and we'll get going by creating the blockchain service and bringing up the instructions to follow for the remainder of the lab. So I will click on Catalog button. I've already logged into Bluemix. I'm going to select from the network services and click on the blockchain service. I'm deploying to a space that doesn't have any other services or applications, so I will just take all the defaults and click on the Create button to create the service. If you happen to get an error here coming up after creating the service and getting access to the dashboard, I would recommend that you clear your history of cookies and cache. There are some cases where this page does not properly initialize with a launch button. We're going to click on this launch button and make sure everything looks okay. And here I see 5 tabs. If you don't see 5 tabs, make sure that you change this. If you see a V1 up here in the URL, change that to a V2. You should see 5 tabs. We are going to be using the APIs and deploy tabs here to get our code up and running in the blockchain network. Now that we've verified the dashboard, for the service, for the blockchain service, let's go back to Bluemix dashboard, and here we're going to click on Docs, and this will get you access to the information that's going to go step by step through the lab. Look over here on Sample Apps and Tutorials, and click here on Hello Chain Code. And there's an overview of the tutorial, and we're going to skip down here to the bit, so implementing your first chain code. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the Go programming language. We'll do it from scratch on this workstation, and then we will get ready to copy the project over from the existing GitHub repository and start writing some code. Okay, so now we're going to download Go and set that up on the workstation. This workstation doesn't have Go installed on it. Click on the link to Golang, so Microsoft Windows Workstation. I'll grab this, save the file. It'll take a little bit of time to download, so we'll just pause here. The download's complete. We'll run the installer. Just take all the defaults, accept the license agreement. While it's installing, let's go back and look at our next steps. So it's very important here about setting your Go path. I'll start a terminal here. We'll make a directory called GoProg. We'll work on all of our projects here in this subdirectory. We're going to add this to the environment. Okay, so now let's go ahead and set the environment for our Go path. I've pulled up the environment variable dialog. I'm going to add a new variable name. We're going to call this Go path. Now these instructions are good for Windows. You want to follow the instructions you see for the Mac platform if you're using that one in Bluemix. That's the same directory we created for our projects. So be sure to be using a shell that has Git support. Start the Git shell. Take a look at the environment here. And yes, Go path and Go root are defined. Go to Go root and now run the command that's shown here to add the Hyperledger shim code. Okay, while that's running, let's just keep on going here. We're going to go over to GitHub and get a copy here. So this is the IBM Blockchain Learn chain code. I'm going to click on Fork to create a local repository into my GitHub. Okay, and now it's down here. This is some instructions. These high-level instructions are good, except if you follow them, you might end up making the wrong copy of the clone. You'll end up, specifically this step here, you might clone the original. Instead, you want to clone your repository, which we'll do in our next step here. Okay, let's clone that repository that we just forked on GitHub into our Go root, Go path. I'm going to make a directory here. I'm going to following on down here, I'll make a directory for my GitHub ID. Now from that directory, I'm going to go ahead and clone my repository. Okay, and as it says here, continuing on our instructions, let's go into the starting point. And let's just make sure that it works with Go, can Go build it. Okay, looks good. So now we're ready to start working on implementing the chain code interface and doing our first steps in working with chain code. Okay, let's start implementing some chain code. So following along in the tutorial instructions, we have three main functions that we are going to need to implement in any piece of chain code in Go. They are init, invoke, and query. We'll follow along here. We have all the sample code for us to use. So the first step here is to find init. Init is going to be run when the chain code is deployed. It's going to set up initial state. And here's a code example that we're literally going to copy and paste in. This code is written in Go. I've got a copy of Atom running, and I'm in my Learn Chain Code directory. So we're going to start by editing chaincodestart.go. I'll scroll down in this to the init function. And here's our init function, and there's no assignment after the initial check. Let's copy the code and paste it right into this block here. And we're just going to put something into the state. A little cleanup here of formatting, and make sure that our addition matches what's shown there. Okay, and we'll save that. That's our first change to implement the init function. Next up, we are going to put in some code into Invoke so that Invoke can be used to do things. In this case, it's going to be used to just write something very simple. And we're going to call a write function, so we need to add an additional handler here in the Invoke code. Already there's a handler for init. We just need to, let's take a look here. In Invoke, already we have a handler for init. We just need to add another function definition for write. We'll do that by copying this else. strip brace in here. We'll want to get rid of that. Right there. Okay, make sure we have the right number of braces. And again, save the file. Okay, since we've defined a write function, now we need to add a write function to our code. This can go anywhere in the Go code. Just for consistency, we'll put it here after the query function, and we'll put in a comment too. Just take a look and make sure we got a good paste in. And so this code here is going to take what's been provided in the arguments and write that into the chain code state. Now we're going to move on to the query function. Similarly, with the query function, we need to add a definition for what to do. So we can provide a function name as an argument to query. In case the application we're going to do or our test is going to be read. So we will define a function for read, and then we'll implement the read function in the Go code. Let's check and see what we already have in query. So already we have something called dummy query. Just replace that sample with our code. Okay. And now we need to add a read function to our code, so let's add that at the bottom. Copy. Okay. So the read function here just goes off and gets state based on the argument that's being provided. Okay. And let's just take a look if our main function already exists or not. In this sample, we do have a main function already, and that's looks to be identical to the example here. Okay, so at this point, you've done your edits into the code. You can save it. And of course, now all this code is here in the start folder. If you look over in the finish folder, there is an example of the code that has all the samples pushed in. Depending on which path you want to use when we're doing our deploy statement, you can either deploy the edited version of code that we've got here in the start folder, or we can deploy the finished version of code. If you have trouble with getting your code to deploy or it's not working right, you can always go and work with the finished version of the chain code. Well, next up on our steps, we're going to navigate to the Swagger API and start doing something on our peers in the blockchain network. So the steps here that you see in the documentation show login to Bluemix. we've already done several of these steps already. Let's just cut ahead here. When I go over to the dashboard, you'll see information here. Here are our APIs that are available for us to use. And to go ahead, for us to be able to make calls to the chain code endpoint, we do need to have a secure context ID. So let's set that up. We're going to follow these steps here to get a network and enroll ID to use, and then call the API endpoint to enroll from this browser session. So you can use any of these users. One trick on Windows is we could use a sticky note. Got a little sticky note here, and I'm going to copy one of these sets of credentials, paste it onto my sticky note. We'll use a sticky note later as well for some other items. Okay. And then next up, we're going to go into the registrar API, and we're going to set up a post to the registrar using these credentials. Okay, and now I just go back to my sticky note, grab my enroll ID, replace that for the enroll ID here in the JSON object, and secret. Try it out. It shows what the curl post was, and then also the response body. And that's what we're expecting. So, deploying the chain code. Always a good piece of advice before you deploy it, make sure it builds. Okay, it builds. Let's send it up to the GitHub repository. Okay, we're going to have push. Okay, now our chain code is up in our Git repository fork. If you wanted to double check that, you could go up and take a look here. Reload this page. To start, add in basic hello world chain code. And here's our updated version of the chain code with our git commit comment. So next up, we're going to add our chain code to the network using the API. And we've already deployed to GitHub. Continuing on with these instructions. So we're going to go back to our Swagger API and expand the chain code API. We're going to have to fill in a few areas. First of all, we're going to only do a deploy. We want to have both the query and invoke blank. And we need to specify a path. And this is going to be the path to our GitHub. In this case, what you watched me do, I did not change. Our code is still over in start. So we don't want to follow the exact example here. We're going to modify this just a little. put that to my GitHub user ID and change this from finished. It should be changed to start. Okay, now we aren't done yet. We still want to provide some initial information during the deployment phase. And so here we're actually going to set the initial state here. We're going to call the function init. We're going to specify arg string hi there. So we're going to make this function to init, and the string will be hi there. Now we also have to set the security context to use that same security context that we used before. Let's pull up our sticky note. Here's the user that we registered with. And put this in here for our secure context. And let's make sure we don't have any things that are hanging out as strings. Looks like we're all ready to deploy our first chain code to the blockchain. I'll try it out. Here's our response. We got a response code of 200 for success, and then we got back a nice long string indicating the ID for the block for our chain code. So it contains a chain code, and we'll actually see this when we look over on the blockchain here. Okay, and we're going to copy this, as the instructions say, over to our sticky note so we can use that. Now we're going to query the chain code to look for that hello world key we set in the init function. And of course we set that with the value in that last call, the invoke. So we're going to go back into the chain code API again, and we're going to put in now the ID of the hash. Make sure that we've filled in our function is going to be the read function. That will invoke that read function that we added to the code. We're going to look for the key hello world, and we need to provide our secure context. So let's go into the Swagger API. Back up here. We don't want to deploy spec this time. Instead, we want to run a query. Chain code ID. Need to copy this from my sticky note. And now the function I'm going to call is my read function. And I'm going to read the hello world key. And I still have to provide my security context. Okay, make sure that we don't have anything else sit here into our chain code API call. We're not sitting a deploy or an invoke spec. Try it out. Okay, and we already have our response back. There's our request, and here's our response body. And we see that when we were doing the deploy, we specified the value of hi there to the key with the init function, and now we are reading out that same exact message. So the last step we're going to do is we're going to exercise the invoke function that we have added in our piece of chain code, and we are going to go ahead and use that write function that we had in the chain code. We're going to change the value of the hello world key to, in this case, so to go away. So let's go back to our API, clear out the query spec, and we will complete invoke. Start with our chain code ID. And we're going to run the function write, because now we're going to write something out. And we're going to write on the hello world key. And what we are going to write is go away. And then we still need to copy over our security context user. Now let's try it out. Okay, and now we have a new message, a status message. We got a response code of 200, so it's likely we're successful. Following on like that. And then, as they say here, to test if it's stuck, rerun the query. So we'll repeat that query that we did before. And our chain code, ID. And we are going to invoke our read function. We are going to invoke it on the key hello world. And we are going to do it with this security context. And let's see what our hello world key is set to now. And now it is set to go away. So there you have it. Hopefully this has been helpful, got you a way to get past any things you might not have seen working correctly. Just as a little bit of a bonus, let's go take a look over onto our service and look at the blockchain itself and take a look at the status here on the blockchain network. And so here's that chain code ID. We see there's a piece of chain code now, and it's up on validating peer 1 because that's the endpoint that we used to send our request. Now let's look over the blockchain status. So we'll see here our blockchain now shows a total of 3 blocks. Now if I look at this particular block, this block shows an example of the invoke method that was run. It shows that we are writing, or using the key hello world, and we wrote the string go away. And this here is our deploy block. So right now we have a total of 3 blocks on our chain. Starting block, the deploy block from when we deploy the chain code, and then finally the block that corresponded to the transaction running the invoke.